Hi there, and welcome to the second part of our early childhood and foundations of learning seminars. Today, we're going to be going a little deeper into phonology and oral language, and primarily with a focus on phonology. So, to get into it, here's a listing of all the key oral language structures we'll be looking at. Once again, these are paramount in throughout education period, but especially in early childhood education. We do want to look at ways that it might differ, ways we might be sensitive to approaching these different areas, key points to consider in each of these areas. And you'll see the nice big green section highlighted here. This is what we'll be focusing on today, which phonology in its essence is basically a speech sound system of an oral language. We'll be focusing heavily on phonemes or getting to phonemes in part of this discussion. This is one of the key aspects of learning to read and write, even though there is other aspects of phonological information that are just as critical as well. But, you know, I hear a lot about phonemic awareness if you're looking in any of these kind of reading science research-based camps these days. These other sections we'll get to, these are equally important. Some people say they're a little higher order, you know, it depends how you want to look at it, but morphology, semantics, syntax, and prosody are all other really key things you want to kind of tune into with students. And yeah, we'll look at those a little later. But essentially all these form the base. So even though we're focusing a lot on oral language is the basis of our print-based systems. And so even when kids are not being formally introduced heavily to text and print and whatnot, picking up on any deficits and being really aware of what to look for within their oral language patterns is super key and gives us a lot of information for who might struggle in the future, who we might want to get as early as possible into some type of remedial situation. So we're going to cover some PH words and phonological processing. So this is basically one's ability to understand and use the sound system of a language. You know, it covers a large range of skills. So if you think phonological, just think phono. It has something to do with this auditory system and all that encompasses. These skills are so important because they really mediate this connection between oral language. So a student in school, hearing the teacher, instructions, stories, you know, writing and sort of anything a kid has to really take in is kind of falling under this umbrella of phonological processing. So there's a lot going on in a classroom. Students taking it in, and if there's any issue in some different areas, which we'll look at these specific areas, that translation of the student being able to start connecting things to the printed word in both reading and writing is going to be taxed or challenged somehow. And, you know, there's a range of how that gets taxed or challenged, and you will have a range in every class you're in, from severe problems that are really apparent to more subtle problems, which sometimes, you know, some kids early on, certain gaps aren't quite as noticeable. They get picked up later. Those can be some of the trickier cases, both in terms of catching as well as remediation, because there's some kids for various reasons we'll look at you catch later. So you really got to be in tune as early as possible. And then even all this stuff, even your higher functioning students benefit from attention in all these areas as well. And they can move quicker, farther, deeper, all that, the more attuned you are as an educator in these areas. So within this big domain of phonological processing, first part, phonological working memory. So basically, this is our ability to take in auditory information and hold it in the short term. So, you know, a teacher is giving directions. Can the student hold, 3, 4, 5 directions and then process that? Can they hold a few pieces of information and start to connect that with what is in their long-term memory or their environment in order to start to build knowledge? So this is a short-term, very temporary thing, but definitely a key marker that comes up in students with learning disabilities and other challenges as well. Is this working memory piece. And when a student can't hold so much in working memory, it does become that much harder. They need that much more repetition in order to make it accessible and stored in long-term memory. And there's lots of pseudo interventions around this. And at the end of the day, the best research we have now does not suggest that there are things we can do that do shift scores in some of this, but directly working on working memory tasks is not proved beneficial. There are some things we can do that assist, which we'll look at with primarily around phonological awareness, but just one thing to keep in mind. Now, the next piece is phonological naming. So this basically has to do with word retrieval and rapid naming of objects, or this comes up a lot in word reading scores, especially in dyslexia. So being able to actually retrieve the phonological information that you may have stored. Some kids slower, some kids are quicker. Some kids you'll see, word retrieval is a big one with early SLP work. Often kids, it's that kid who's like, oh, I just can't think of that word. What's that word? What's it mean? They kind of bumble around with expressing some of this phonological information. And you may have experienced that too as an adult, or anyone kind of goes through this in different ways throughout their life. The next one is phonological awareness, which we'll look at a little deeper later, because this is an area that is teachable. It is very coachable. We can make progress on it, and it makes a big difference and assists in these other areas with students. And the key thing here with phonological awareness is that it's a big umbrella term of phonological, which has to do with different language structures that students might be manipulating, becoming aware of. So can they rhyme? Can they break words into syllables? These are bigger structures of language. And then when we get down to individual sounds, that's the phoneme, and that's falls under this umbrella of phonological awareness, which once again is under this umbrella of phonological processing. But when we delve down to it, when we come down to it, and that phoneme is going to be really critical when we start learning letter sounds, when we start trying to get students to read things in print. It's the big gateway skill in all of this that student really needs, and probably should be one of the biggest areas of focus out of any of this process. So when all this is intact and all this is working well, the phonological representation of words that students are hearing, a student has a depth to that within their system. So they have a deep representation of the words. So, and then it's easier for retrieval, it's easier for usage, reading, all these things come together. And there's different aspects that can reinforce students holding on to that information, like meaning, usage. If the student's writing, they need transcription skills, which might slow them down even if they have the word. But this deep phonological imprint is very important to have. And you might think, for example, when it's not as strong, you might think of a student when they're starting to learn harder words. So like, imagine learning, I don't know, your second grade, trying to learn the word rhinoceros. There's a lot going on in the word rhinoceros. You might hear rhinoceros, or so some weird variation that comes up, and without having each sound represented firmly, attaching it to meaning and all these other aspects, it becomes harder to read and write. So this is a big umbrella of phonological processing. Now, how does it develop? You're going to see different models of this, and this one I feel is kind of gives a little more accurate reality of kind of the overlap and some of the nuance here. Sometimes you'll just see a straight kind of stepping stone kind of a skill-based thing, and it's important to remember too that this is a chart of typical development, and it's also a typical development for the phonological awareness skills. Doesn't necessarily mean this has to be a blueprint for instruction. Okay, so but which has happened a lot in different programs over time. They've kind of replicated this with instructions. Not to say that it's bad, not to say that it's horrible, but as an educator, once again, we do want to be looking at these other things, be considering these other things, but we're really interested in this endpoint, this phoneme synthesis. So just real quick to dive into this chart, you'll see that there's this overlap and there's a range for when these skills develop with children. So sentence segmentation is often, pulling apart words within a sentence and, really large structures. Alliteration identification, playing with first sounds in words that may sound the same and be repeated, from identifying hearing it to being able to produce them. So you'll see this stretches all the way from 2 to about 4. Overlapping here is syllable synthesis. So break a word, banana, to, you hear the syllables, banana, right? Going to onset rhyme synthesis. So an onset rhyme is splitting off the beginning consonant or consonant cluster in a word from the rest of the kind of the rest of the word. So it's a nice gateway skill too into phonemes. Sometimes it depends on what the clusters are, but once again, it's not always functioning at the phonemic level. And then we have rhyme identification and rhyme production. So this is, our basic rhyming words, schemes. And so all these things can be markers. So usually these can be pretty predictive for, what might be coming up with the student's ability to manipulate other phonological tasks, such as phonemic awareness. And a lot of studies do suggest, kids who are successful with this easily early on do become better readers. So these are things we want to be looking out for, things we want to be noting. We'll talk about instruction and stuff a little later with all this. Once again, we're just getting our overview as we go through this. But the last thing that starts to develop is phoneme synthesis and phoneme analysis here. So that ability to hear different parts of a word and bring them together, make different parts of the words, and varying by length of sounds, how many sounds we can do, continues to develop. So you'll notice this whole trajectory from about 2.5 to 5.5, upwards of 6. Ideally, kids are gonna be able to do these skills by the time they hit kindergarten without too much issue. And it does too, some kids might need a little more instruction and help along this way, roughly 20-30%. It might not come easy, but with a little instruction early on, you're creating a really strong foundation for that student to attach the print to the sound patterns that they're using. And even depending on your school, using the letter patterns, blocks, dice, all this stuff we'll talk about in instruction can help garner these skills even further. So that's our basic developmental sequence. Now, we're going to start diving a little deeper into our basic definition. So phonology versus phonemes, which I've already discussed. And we're going to look a little deeper at the phonemes in the language now, because you're going to need to be really comfortable with these as a teacher of literacy when we get to print. Now, phonemes, once again, are the individual sounds in a language. depending how you count them. Now there's different reasons for why linguists might argue this way or that way, but there's 40 to about 44 in SAE, or Standard American English, which is what the focus of this course is. I'm an American educator, even though a lot of this can extend to other forms of English. Just be aware that there's differences once you get into Australia or Britain or other dialects where things are spoken. Within the language, we have 25 consonant sounds, and we have 19 vowel sounds. So that is, remember, this is sounds, not letters. So once we start attaching these sounds to letters, this is where some of the confusion can start coming in English. Now we have within this, these are three terms that we want to be familiar with if we're not already. So we have diphthongs, and these are basically complex vowel sounds that occur where there's some movement of the lips and tongue that make it a little trickier for some kids to recognize. So like oi and ow, if you say those, which we'll look at a chart soon, there's some movement versus saying something like a long vowel like a, where you can kind of hold it. The R controls are another kind of complex pattern, and these are or, R. So when I say that, you'll notice that my lips and my tongue, there's actually some movement in my mouth versus something like ooh, where I'm just holding it. And then the last one here is schwa. This is probably the most dreaded thing, especially for students who are challenged. Schwa is basically a vowel sound in an unstressed, unaccented syllable in a word. The vowel sound, you can say, it gets lazy. You can say it doesn't conform to what we might normally think is going to be in there. And the great example that I've picked up is the word banana. Right, we have 3 A's in banana, and if we were just pronouncing those with like short A's or something, we say banana, right? And if we're pronouncing each of those we're stressing all our vowels as we go through language as a whole, it'd be really taxing. So because of the spoken nature of it, we say banana. It rolls off the tongue easier. It's smoother. We don't stress every single vowel in that reality. So that's where schwa comes into place. And we'll look at that a little deeper later. Yeah. So vowels. What is a vowel? And if you don't think about this too much, sometimes I ask this to kids a lot, and they get the A-I-O-U. A lot of teaching, we get stuck in the print reality, the letter reality. But as far as starting from a spoken standpoint, which is what we're doing here, based on best research practice, speech to print, a vowel is basically it's a continuous sound where the air is not obstructed when we're saying that sound. So we can just hold these sounds. Some of you may have seen this vowel valley here. And there's different iterations of this. And I'm just going to say right off the bat, I'm not super wild about some of what's going on here, which I'll explain. But it has become kind of a trend as people have gotten interested in research and some of these methods to build sound walls that look like this and include all these pictures of different mouth positions for each of the vowels or the consonants and things like that. I do feel, depending on the student, depending on your class, depending on what you're teaching, yes, going over a little bit of mouth position can be handy, can be very useful. If you're going to create, space in your class to make a sound wall like this, and we have some resources in the member stuff for things to look at deeper like that. only if a student has, some issues with producing sound and some oral motor issues, is really a focus like this gonna be used in general. I would suggest. Once again, I know it's becoming a trend to do this, but unless the student's getting some SLP help and is really having a hard time feeling their mouth and how sound is produced, this can be a lot of overload on a student, so not every student's going to need this level of scaffolding, I feel, and others. But the key thing here is looking at the vowel sound, and yes, giving some examples of the grapheme patterns, maybe a picture mnemonic to go along with that to help implant the sound, and what's going on. All this is really good, really quality. And this whole chart is organized and it's adapted from pretty common linguistic stuff of how the vowels are produced. And real quick, I'll go through the sounds. We have E, we have A, A, I, and now fully open, we have ah, ah, oh, ooh, ooh, you. And you'll notice as we start open and up here, your mouth starts getting closed. So if you have the slides here, you can pause and kind of play with that yourself. So these are the core vowels, and then these other more complex ones, we have our R, or, and then we have our oi and our ow. Okay. So it's really important to get really comfortable with saying the sounds clean, being comfortable with positions, and sometimes too we'll include the schwa somewhere on a list like this, which can take different forms, but it's important to mention that as far as the key vowel sounds. Once again, in the resources, there's stuff to help you with pronunciation and really getting clear sounds, because different people, different regions, you might not hear all of these in the way that we commonly do, or what is come to being known as standard American English. So it's important to play with this a little bit in your own, and also, we'll look at print later, but getting really clear on some of the grapheme patterns associated with this. So it is a bit of a study in itself, but that's the basic layout of this. And this is just the beginning. We want to just get our basics down before we start learning how to use it, what we want to teach, how to assess, all that. All right, so we had our vowels. We're going to look at consonants. Now, this is a chart I put together from different sources and added a few things. So gonna kind of explain this in a couple ways. So just to orientate you, up top here is how the sounds are being produced in the mouth. And here is how these sounds are categorized, what type of sounds they are. And this is, once again, coming from the linguistics world. I'm not using the International Phonetic Alphabet. Some teachers feel that's an important part of their work. If you feel like you have the time to, that's great. I've just represented each key sound here with a slash mark. So anytime you see slashes like this in either my material or elsewhere, it's referencing the sound here, not the letter. So that's a key distinction to make for why those slashes are there. So let's see, where am I going to start? We'll start with the sounds, and we can talk a little bit about how they're produced here. Now, and I'll just make a note here how they're produced. we're starting from the front of the mouth with the lips closed. And as we go across here, it moves to the back of the mouth and the back of the throat with the sounds produced back there. You'll also notice that some of these are in red and some of these are in green. Red are basically stop sounds, or sounds we can't hold. Green sounds are sounds we can hold open, and similar to vowels, basically. I put this in here because this is a key distinction. Not every program's organized like this. Some are, but there's a method of teaching blending called continuous blending that's really supportive for kids with working memory issues and early blending, where when you're reading, you actually don't want to break up each sound so clearly, but actually hold the sound. And so like I believe the SIPS program actually does this really well with how they introduce different sounds and things of this nature. But yeah, it's a supportive function within a scope and sequence. So it's something to look out for if you're making your own scope and sequence. This information can be pretty useful. So if you have the slide, you can study it and kind of get things off of that. So over here, we have the stop sounds. And the other key distinction here is voiceless and voice. So in our bilabial means our lips closed. And we're going to puff out some portion of air, which is kind of what a consonant is defined in, where the air gets constricted. With vowels, the air isn't constricted. With consonants, the air gets constricted somehow. So this is one basic way to understand the difference between vowels and consonants. Also can help with your students feeling that out. So yeah, in the first one is the stop sound. So we have p and b, p, b. So the voiceless, if you play with this, you'll see it's just a straight air. With a voice sound, you're usually going to feel basically some vibration in your throat. Okay, so b, b, you can actually feel the movement, whereas p, p, it's more airy, if you will. And this is important because these sounds kind of occur in the same place in a mouth, and these can be areas of confusion for some students who struggle with production or hearing sounds and things of this nature. We skip here, alveolar. So this, with the tongue, goes back to the ridge of the teeth. We have t, t, and d, d. So once again, you can notice with the t, t, there's some air coming through. The d, there's less air coming through. And then going across, we're once again, we're coming back into the mouth. We have k, k, and g, g. A little more air in the k, more voice, more in the throat with the g. Okay, so all these are stop sound. Then we have our fricative, and I'm not going to go through all these, but I'll just point out some key things. We have our unvoiced, we have our voiced, and with fricative, there's a little more friction, right? One way to think of it in the production of these sounds. So we have t, v, v, right? You can feel that coming a little more. And you notice too, a lot of these, almost all of them, are open sounds. So great sounds to build some words for continuous blending. You can mix in all your vowels in here. So like the, you can hold that. Or let's see, sat. You can hold that till the very end, right? Where we put that stop sound at the end. Affricate is kind of a combination of a stop and fricative sound. So it kind of blends both. And you notice there's only a couple in this category here. And there's a ch, which kind of starts off at a t sound and ends with a sh. So ch. So there's this combination of two patterns going on there. And then there's the j, which kind of has a d and a j kind of mixed in there. So this is affricate is a combination of these. And then for the nasal, and so all these we see are voiced from here on out. Okay, so these Nasal is, we feel it a little more in the nasal cavity. So you can feel some vibration coming up in the head. And then we have which some people have a question. Is that one sound? Is it two sounds? I could debate this honestly, but for most intensive purposes and most phonic sequences, this is its own separate sound, own separate pattern compared to the and it comes as a unit. And usually you're going to see this in, you know, like song, sing. So it's usually coming at the end of a word. Okay. Or sorry, like after a vowel too. Yeah, that's a big, a very key distinction with this. Some of these other ones can come in most positions in words. So our last two sections here are the liquid and the glides. So these ones can be a little trickier, and especially the liquid. So these are some of the harder ones for kids to pronounce early on. Because there's some movement of the lip and tongue that has to happen here. So if a student's younger, they haven't quite coordinated those things, or there's genuine speech impediment that needs correction. These are often some culprits, and you might hear a kid saying something like "whoa" for "lol," right? So this control of the tongue is a little trickier. Glides are similar, and these also occur only before vowels. And we have "w" here, "w." So we have and "y," "y." Once again, there is some movement of the lips and tongues here, and I put the WH here as a asterisk. This is something that is slowly disappearing within standard American English. This is the "w," right? That unvoiced sound. So we have "w," which you can kind of feel, and "w," like "w." If you were, you might still hear this in British English sometimes. As far as standard American English, you know, this is why words like "what," you know, we're not saying "what," right? So we're saying "what." It's a strong voiced W that is becoming more and more prominent. So depending on your program, depending the linguist you talk to, a lot of factors, this might be included. You know, something to be aware of. So this is a consonant chart. So this, between this and the vowel valley and some of the extra resources that we've given in the when you support, then you can study these, and it's definitely a key thing to be comfortable with. Now, phonological development with consonant acquisition. So consonants are actually more difficult to pick up than vowels for most children. Even though vowels do create a bigger problem when kids are reading or writing, because of the amount of patterns and the mappings and whatnot, consonants are harder to acquire within speech and producing and things of that nature. Once again, depending on a lot of factors, you might see charts that vary a little bit from this, but by and large, you're going to see this is the general projection. This one comes from ASHA, which is the organizing body for speech language therapists. Again, in the hyperlink slides, you can kind of look at some of the source material that this is coming from if you want to dig deeper. But you'll see here from about 2 to 3, we have p, m, h, n, w, and b. And then k, k, d, t, ng are coming in here somewhere in the 2 all the way up to 6 range, depending, but there's a variation, right? So just because the kid isn't producing some of these things, doesn't mean, you know, we want to freak out too early on. However, you'll notice that by about the age of 6 here, most of the consonant sounds are either on their way or pretty solidified. So you know, those kids who are having any weird speech things going on around this age, definitely want to flag. And, you know, maybe it's a little extra help, little more pointers. And especially, you know, we're getting the 6 to 8 range of stuff starting to drop here. Yeah, we need to look at, because once again, that ability to produce the sounds is going to strongly impact that ability to pick them up in reading and writing. So, yeah, links to literacy. So once again, I've alluded to some of this. We have 40 to 44 phonemes, only 26 graphemes. So the grapheme, the letter, or the single letters within the language, we have that. And then we have different grapheme patterns, about 250 core grapheme patterns, which we're linking, you know, our sounds to within the language at our phonemic level. Okay, so that's just one level of the language. I'll touch on that in a second here, which leads to what happens why it's important to explicitly teach the code. We might have the same sound being represented with different spellings, or we might have the same spelling making different sounds within words. And for a kid with dyslexia, or, you know, even some kids with other language issues, this can be confusing early on. So it's good to be really explicit with the young ones from early on. And one way we want to orientate too, you'll see different groupings of these things for different purposes, but the research consensus coming is that it's really important to move from a speech basis, a sound basis, what's the students hearing, listening, breaking apart those phonemes, and then applying that into print. Not necessarily starting with print, so all these different patterns and then trying to produce the sounds. So if you're organizing your charts, that's why those sound walls, or like the vowel valley, you'll see that's organized by the sound pattern that's coming up in. Or if you're gonna, you know, add consonants in there, you want those core consonants that the children are making, and then under that you can have, you know, different patterns that represent that sound. Okay, and you'll see a lot of crossover. So if you're new to this, don't worry. Yeah, it's a lot to kind of throw at, and I'm not digging in the weeds yet on this. We'll slowly we'll open that up a little later. But just to get your head around the complexity and why this is important. Now, ultimately, English is morphophonemic. So it combines morphology, the meaning parts of a language, with the sound elements of the language. Now, that means you can explain why a word is, you know, just going from only sound only approach to just print only approach doesn't always explain why something's spelled a certain way, why it's organized a certain way, things of this nature. This has led some camps, like the structured word inquiry camp, to feel like you should just jump straight into heavy morphology work, maybe not heavy, but, you know, different morphology work right from the outset. And I don't think many people in any structured camp are against morphology, even early on with some certain morphological structures like plurals or tenses and things of that nature, especially in oral language, because those are very important, which we'll talk about. But without a basis in understanding root words and understanding basic word construction, you know, once a kid does have some basic grapheme phoneme patterns and is able to do some basic things, that's, you know, at least from a lot of the structured literacy people and researchers I've looked into and discussed with, that's when, yeah, tossing on morphological endings, prefixes, things of this nature, we feel is for sure relevant and can happen quite early. I'm not going to disagree with that, but giving a base, especially for some of these struggling students, is key. So, you know, that's one aspect we'll look at more into, especially moving into when we get into some of the other oral language structures, such as morphology. Important to note, other languages. So even though standard American English is what's used in academic discourse, what's used, for most teaching purposes in the schools, that's what we're teaching to. We have to be sensitive to both other dialects and other languages, because it's inevitable as an educator, you're going to come across that. Depending your school setting, it may be different percentages of that reality. A dialect, and every language has a dialect depending on what part of the country you're in, or even city versus rural. It's going to have some differences depending on the setting, things of that nature. All sorts of dialects can crop up in a language, so that pronunciation, the sounds that we're looking at may differ in some words, or may differ altogether with how it's applied. And it's something to be sensitive to. And it's not that, language is a fluid thing. It's not that how you're speaking is the wrong way. You need to, how we're speaking is right. But we do need to be, clear that there is, in order to read how certain things have been put in print in certain places, some of this standard, quote unquote, which standard is obviously a shifting target in linguistics, but the common usage for our current time period and what's being taught in school is an important thing that we have to grapple with. Yeah, and in different languages, so different languages have different phonemes. Not every language has the same, or is using the same set of phonemes, and how those phonemes interact to make up words are going to have different rules within different languages as well, which can get confusing, but it's also the base of a lot of this. So it's also really important for second language learners to get some dosage of the English phonemic system, and being clear, and you too, as well as an educator, having some idea of where some of this breakdown might occur. And now I've chosen Spanish as the example here, just because it is, especially in America, definitely one of the more common languages that we come up with, particularly where I'm at. I'm in California, so definitely a large Mexican population, and a lot of ELL students in different settings around here. So definitely an important language to get your head around with how this is working. And so just to give you some basic idea, and I have more links in the added resources that kind of goes into this, that makes it a lot more clear. But Spanish, as opposed to English, has mainly 5 pure vowels, and then there's actually 14 diphthongs that go together to make up a little more complexity there. There are 2 semivowels and glides, kind of like our ois, and then there are 17 core consonants sounds. Now, one thing that's different from Spanish and some other languages that makes it easier to learn is that each sound has a corresponding grapheme pattern. So that link between the phonemic system and the written system is a lot more clear in there, which can also often make learning those languages quicker and easier compared to English. And it doesn't mean that there's less prevalence of something like dyslexia, but oftentimes it can be a little less confusing in teaching it and wrapping your head around it. Now, here's a key point, especially on the phonemic side of things. In Spanish, they're missing, they're not using these sounds. So, th, v, z, sh, j, j. And then consonant blends are not as prevalent in this language. So with S blends, so something like st in the word stop, sk in school, are something that's in consonant blends can be tricky alone for a lot of students, but especially when it's not in your native language, when you're not hearing it at home, when you're not primed for it, this can be a tricky area where you might need to practice a little more with some of these students. So some errors that might crop up because of the drop sound, a student might say since is not as readily available in their, phonological awareness, instead of saying thought, they might say something like sought, because it's close. You notice how it's pronounced closely with s and th, but they're more used to that pronouncing this sound when when they hear something like that. So you might see this might come up in the writing, so many things. Or here, since there's not a sh sound that's prevalent in Spanish, you might get chot instead of shot. Or here, zip, since there might be some trouble hearing zzz, you might hear sip instead of zip, which I don't want to sip my jacket. I want to zip my jacket. So, these little phonemic errors can really make a big difference. Besides for the phonemic layer, which is what our focus now, there are rules at other layers of language as well, that create other issues when we're going from speaking to reading and writing. Within word building, so for example, CVC is a common pattern with early English words, so like sat, mat, cat, hat, all that. But in English, CV is a little more common. So like a word like taco, right? We have a consonant, a vowel, consonant, a vowel. That pattern is a little more prevalent with easier and early words. Syntax, morphology, so these higher levels we'll talk about. All those things have their own unique shifts within Spanish versus English as well, that create other complications. But this is one of our core bases here that we need to build off of and get clean with. So that's our introduction to the phonology and the oral nature of phonology. Here's a little quiz for you. If you have these slides and you have access for our forums, please go through this, post it, and we can discuss. For the rest of you, I'm glad you joined us, and I am going to sign off, and I hope to see you on the next installment when we'll look at the other structures of oral language. Take care.